The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listeners-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Cosmic Catastrophe on Revolution.radio. I am your host, Diamond from the Oppenheimer Ranch Project, and joining us today is my lovely partner and co-host, Leah Shaper.
Hello.
Welcome to the show. You're looking lovely.
Well, thank you. That's a nice compliment considering I'm fairly underslept.
I wanted you to say that. That's how I draw that out.
Yeah, so if I'm not so sharp today, that is why.
We've got a great show. It is, in fact, yesterday was the 324th anniversary of the Cascadia Megathrust and Tsunami, which occurred back in 1700 in a fateful night in December. Around 9 p.m., actually, we know. So we're going to talk about the Cascadia Megathrust. And the reason we're bringing this to your attention is because it will happen again. And good news, the USGS has just released an update to the seismic hazard map. So we'll get to take a look at that. And they've got Puget Sound in the crosshairs there because they know what we're about to share.
What does an update mean? Like they've updated their algorithms? Like, what do you mean?
The seismic hazard map is that colorful one that shows you where the most likelihood of a large eruption is.
Yeah, okay, gotcha.
They added a few more red areas.
Ah, gotcha.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm echoing a little bit, and I think it's because my phone is sitting here, so I will be right back.
Okay, cool. We are also going to be talking about Willie Soon. We had him on the show right after he was on Tucker Carlson, and it was that very day that Harvard removed him from the internet and, pretends that he didn't spend 3 decades there.
Right.
But he was then recently canceled this week by the mainstream climate agenda, and we'll show you what they have to say there. And we'll give you a little basic CO2 science, which will probably get us demonetized. We're also going to talk about the Center for Countering Digital Hate's most recent expose called The New Climate Denial, where we actually made the top 97 climate denialists on the entire internet.
I was about to say there's an awful lot of, canceling anti-global warming people going on this week. And not only did we make the list, but we were featured in their report.
Yeah, we were one of the featured out of 96. We had a whole expose. It was nice.
By the way, I can't wait to rip that report apart because there's a lot wrong with it.
Well, buckle up. And if we have time, we're going to talk about an amazing correlation that's just come to light with the Ryan Maui data and hurricane frequency as it relates to sunspots. It's a very startling correlation, which
and obvious.
It says a little bit that our sun is controlling the weather here on Earth, perhaps.
Wow, what do you know?
So what we're going to do here, unfortunately, in Radio Land, you can't see this, but we're going to start sharing the screen so that viewers later tonight will be able to see all the fantastic things we're talking about. Now, the first topic of discussion is the 324th anniversary of the Cascadia Megathrust. This is the largest known earthquake in the United States, which happened in 1700. It's estimated to be between magnitude, well, let's just read the data here. They estimate a magnitude between 8.7 and 9.2.
So let's say 9.
So this 9 magnitude quake, massive amounts of displacement across the surface. And there has been numerous studies over the last 100 years diving into this, not only scientific research, but cultural research. And all the pieces have come together in recent years to give a very specific date that this quake occurred January 26, 1700, around 9 p.m. local time.
That was Japan, though, wasn't it? Or no?
Well, no, they reversed the time. That's the actual time of the
sorry.
quake.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they use the travel time of the propagation of the waves to
Yes.
determine that. And we did share on our Twitter yesterday one of the most recent updates on what that tsunami wave would look like during a 9 magnitude megathrust. What's interesting is people don't realize how high the Hawaiian Islands are here. These are 7-mile high mountains in the ocean. They're not just the little tiny islands that stick above the water.
Yeah.
So when the tsunami hits the Hawaiian Island chain, take a look at how it bounces off of them, causing a secondary tsunami to propagate back and hit the Aleutian Islands.
Yeah.
And then the coast again.
Well, and then wouldn't you get sort of 2 waves of it coming back on you, because you would get the pushback from the Hawaiian Islands, but then also from the west coast of the Pacific, east coast of the Pacific, east coast of the Pacific.
Yeah, well, they're not really. This model doesn't show that far.
Right. So if the model continued, then you'd get that back wave from the other side of the Pacific as well.
Right, and all of these secondary tsunami waves are much smaller than the initial front.
Yeah. I was noticing too how interesting it is that the Aleutian Islands really disrupt the whole tsunami.
Yeah, they do have a lot to do with putting a breaker on it. And it's interesting how Hawaii, even though it does have a bounce back effect, has no effect of the forward propagation. It's as if the tsunami washes straight over the islands.
Well, it's kind of like the slit experiment, right? When you have an energy wave. Well, I'm not going to be able to describe that accurately now due to my sleep deprivation, but it's a bit like the slit experiment.
Let's talk about some cultural research here. Some stories of the past contain temporal clues that this actually happened. The Kawakawawaka or the Kawakutli stories from the north end of Vancouver Island report a nighttime earthquake that caused virtually all houses in their community to collapse. The Cowichan stories from Vancouver Island's inner coast speak of another nighttime earthquake, which caused landslides that buried an entire village. And the Macau stories from Washington speak of a great nighttime earthquake, of which the only survivors were those who fled inland before the tsunami hit. So these are all very accurate accounts of exactly what happened.
Mm-hmm.
January 26th at 1700. Even the Kilouette or the Kilouette people of Washington have a story about a flood so powerful that villagers in their canoes were swept inland all the way to Hood Canal, wherever that is.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wonder where that is.
So that's pretty interesting. But the bad news is the future threat to this region. This region has been built up quite a bit since 1700. You're supposed to say something there.
Yes, I understand and I agree.
So all around Vancouver Island and the Olympic Peninsula, there are millions of people. And this is just a regional area which is at extreme threat to tsunamis. Tsunamis coming into the inlet here, into the Salish Sea, that are, up to 20 feet high. And that's where all the people live. They all live there.
Well,
and
look,
if another
Seattle
scenario,
is right there in the tributaries.
Yeah, if another scenario like the 9 magnitude happens at night, how many people would be able to escape? It would literally be gridlock if they put out an alarm.
Yeah. I mean, it's like any other major city in that respect. If, SHTF, then you're sort of screwed in terms of your ability to get out. And this is certainly an example because you would need to get out very quickly to avoid a tsunami.
Right. And right in Seattle, the fault runs right through the center of the Puget Sound, which is where the tsunami would kick off.
So stupid.
So the entire city of Seattle would be like the day after tomorrow type tsunami, where you actually just see this huge wall of water coming and there's nowhere to go.
Well, pardon me for being crude, but given the state of Seattle's these days, maybe it's not such a bad thing.
It would be a good washing.
Yeah.
But look at this. Look at how many people are here.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
And so when that tsunami hits Smith Cove and Elliott Bay, that's where all the people are. It washes inland here a mile.
Yeah.
So that would immediately drown hundreds of thousands of people in Harbor Island and the surrounding area south of Seattle.
Not a good plan, long-term plan to be in this area.
In December 29th, which is less than a month ago of this year, the USGS put out a new 50-state national seismic hazard model. They re-updated the map based on new information, and we're showing that shiny map right now. The darkened regions on the map are population centers. You can see why we live in the Four Corners region. It is one of the furthest area away from population centers. The only other place on the map like that is up in the state line in North Dakota and Montana. But I don't know what's going on up here in Canada. There might be big cities right across the border.
Right.
There probably are. Most of the cities in Canada are on the border. But you can see what happened here in, if you're watching tonight, if you're listening, what they did is they updated the seismic risk for Washington State, specifically around the Puget Sound, and it has a large area of dark red now.
Yeah.
And that means that there is a very high likelihood, 75 to 90%, 95% of a large earthquake shaking this area in the next 100 years.
Yikes.
Right. And we know the periodicity on the Cascadia thrust is around 250 years, and we are now at the 324th anniversary. So there is an additional 75 years of pressure on this baby.
Yeah, that's seriously overdue.
Yeah, so that's bad news for the Pacific Northwest, because once it happens, if it destroys everything on the coast, insurance is not going to settle those claims.
No.
Yeah. Where are
where
are those people going?
Right.
Yeah, so that's just one more bad thing to add to the list of things. Happy anniversary, Cascadia. And I didn't pull up the graph of all the known earthquakes that have slipped on that Megathrust, but the periodicity is about 250 years. We're long overdue. But I will drop it below in the links for the video later, so that if you want to go check that out, you can. Now, 3 days ago from the No Trick Zone, a new article says the Journal of Climate Study reduces doubled CO2 climate sensitivity by 40% to 0.72 C. That might sound like a bunch of gobbledygook, but what it means is in plain sight, all the fear-mongering models have been cut in half based on the reality of this data analysis. Yeah. What it shows is that even if we double CO2 to around 700 or 800, the temperature based on the math barely rises by even 0.18 C maybe.
Yeah.
Now, the problem with this is they're using climate models that consider CO2 a warming agent, which we all know is not true for a number of reasons. CO2, first of all, is plant food, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but it also increases at a regular interval. We humans have had a number of things to reduce CO2 on Earth, including a pandemic, which almost drove all human-based CO2 to a halt. And if you look at the Mauna Loa CO2 data, we have never been able to affect the slope of the graph.
Right.
And that should say everything.
Well, that coupled with the fact that every time you look at a graph of CO2 corresponded with temperature, it's temperature rising that is leading the graph, not CO2, which means that temperature rise causes CO2 rise. CO2 rise does not cause temperature rise.
And if we look at it on an annual scale, you can see that what's controlling CO2 on Earth is the sun. The CO2 peaks in the middle of summer and drops down in the middle of winter. So
which goes right along with what I just said.
The sun and the respiration of our forests are breathing the CO2 into the atmosphere.
I mean, it's a great way of thinking about it, that this is like the breathing of Earth, right? Because obviously in the warmer months is when trees are more active and actually growing, so they need more CO2. I mean, they need more, CO2 and oxygen in terms of inhaling and exhaling. So it only makes sense.
And even using their faulty graphs, if we double the amount of CO2 on Earth, it barely budges the temperature using their fraudulent methods.
Yeah.
So here's some of the fraudulent methods. This is the scary temperature graph that they've adjusted to make it seem like it's been rapidly rising since the 1960s. But it's
Where
all
is the 1930s warming in this graph?
It's right here, this little blip, I guess. But
Yeah,
34 is the hottest year on record. And on this graph, it's nothing more than like a blip.
Yeah.
So, and this graph is created using tree ring data, not temperature data.
Yeah.
Only the recent few decades they've added temperature, but that's adulterated temperature data in areas that are warming due to the urban heat island effect. So they're manufacturing their warming simply by keeping their stations in cities that are rapidly growing.
Yeah.
And that's been proven. And it's also been proven, if you look at the data set back to 1880, that if you change the scale, you can erase even their catastrophic warming.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
So they play a lot of tricks, but this in fact is the no trick zone.
Well, can you go back a second to the article we were just talking about? Because the other problem with this, as pointed out here, is that this calculation that they've now made makes it such that there's basically like no forcing going on at the poles, right? That's even negative in Antarctica. So then it makes it even more ridiculous.
Well, the most ridiculous thing about their climate change narrative and blaming humans is that a new paper coming out, peer reviewed, shows that the human portion of the annual CO2 input is less than 5%.
Yeah.
So that's within the margin of error of any calculation.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter how much humans put into the atmosphere. We don't put enough in to affect the other 95%.
Right.
Which is outgassed mostly by the ocean.
Yeah.
Because the trees are rapidly gobbling it up next to the factories producing it.
Right. I wonder how humans compare to the rocks that Judith Curry was so worried about.
Yeah, now the rocks are off gassing. So this is a multi-layer approach to the scam, and now they're just literally canceling everyone. You know, they canceled Tim Ball. Michael Mann took him to court, and Tim Ball died fighting for the truth.
Yeah.
God rest his soul. And then now Willie Soon gets a message from Tucker Carlson and says, all right, I got to do this.
Yeah.
He knows what it means.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care because we had him on the show. He cares about the truth. He cares about science.
Yeah.
So even if they're coming for him, he's going to continue to move forward. Because now he's an independent scientist working with Sari Science, his own group that he created that's independently funded.
Yeah.
By people listening like you. Go to Sari Science and fund Willie Soon and his group, and you can help out. So this is coming from Climate Feedback. Evidence greenhouse gases cause global warming denied by Willie Soon in Tucker Carlson interview, resulting in mass social media climate misinformation.
The language here is very funny because it's as if they're talking about like a pandemic, the way that well, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by that, right? Because the World Economic Forum and like the UN and the WHO, they talk about, misinformation being like a public health issue. So I shouldn't be surprised that they're conflating those two things in this language here.
But they're using the exact same attack on their own tactics, resulting in mass social media climate misinformation. That's what's been going on for 2 decades.
Yeah. Right.
So Willie Soon's claim was carbon dioxide does not cause global warming, and scientists are 90% sure it's the sun. The climate problems blamed on carbon dioxide, such as ocean acidification and negative impacts on polar bears, are not real. Those are all true statements.
Correct.
But the Climate Feedback Network claims their verdict is that that's incorrect. Now, we already know that the polar bear scam is a scam because of Dr. Susan Crawford, who has shown that the polar bear populations went from about 7,000 in the 1960s to over 60,000 in the 2000s.
Yeah.
No
Can you
polar-
scroll down a smidge?
Yeah.
Oh, where was this? It's just this language when they defy Willie Soon's claim here. It's just so silly because they're talking about scientific consensus again, as
the
if that's
light
a
bulb
thing.
here. The cause of climate change and global warming are well known among international scientific community.
Yeah.
Scientific consensus based on overwhelming evidence beyond reasonable doubt. It's like we're in a court here.
Yeah.
Shows anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions are the main driver of global warming.
I mean, it's funny because they don't even bother to explain it.
Not the sun.
They just say it's wrong because all the scientists agree that it's wrong.
Well, it can't be the sun.
Even that's not true, right? There is no consensus here. That's nonsense, and it's meaningless anyway.
If they understood what the science, they would understand that it can't be the sun because they use a solar constant.
Yes.
So their model says that the sun never changes, though every day we seem to have a very large temperature shift on the planet.
Right. When the sun is out, it's warm, and when it's not, it's cold.
But the sun does not create the temperature on Earth. It's the greenhouse gas.
Right, right. I mean, this whole hoax is essentially based on the idea that we haven't that the scientists working on this have never separated the background noise, right? It's like it's as ridiculous as being worried about the CO2 being off-gassed by rocks, which are just part of the background noise. There's never been any differentiation made between the background noise, the natural things that happen on Earth, and man's contribution. And even if you were to do that, as we just illustrated earlier, man's contribution is so insignificant, it wouldn't amount to anything anyway, which is why they don't make that distinction.
Yeah, exactly.
But yet we have gone through ice ages multiple times. So how do they explain that? It's so ridiculous.
Well, it's the human population is so big now. We've taken over the weather as of 1930.
Well, see, what they should do then they should claim that every time the Earth has come out of an ice age and warmed, they should then conclude that the human population was much larger than what we typically say to account for the warming, right? It's like, so ridiculous.
Well, what we're going to show you here just came out a few days ago. Roger Pielke Jr. posted a 3-year running sum of major hurricane frequency. This was collated by Ryan Maui, who is the king of tropical storm data. And the Maui plot is in blue. And what he then did was overlay in orange the SILSO sunspot number. Now, if you don't know what SILSO is, it's the Solar Influences Data Analysis Center. It is the sunspot indexing and long-term solar observation station. So it's where all the sunspot data is. So he didn't like take it from a special place. He took it from the main place.
Mm-hmm.
And the correlation is astounding.
Yeah.
Now, what I mean by astounding is when you see sunspots go up, down, and up here, like at this fluctuation, and there's a direct correlation to the weather on Earth, it starts to blow your mind that there has to be a direct connection between the sun and hurricane frequency.
Yep.
And so the question is, what is the sun doing to increase hurricane frequency? And what's happened in the last few decades is we've reached the cosmic ray maximum. So the last several sunspot cycles, cosmic rays have been the highest ever recorded. And that happens during sunspot minimum, not during maximum. Mm-hmm. And we also know through the cloud experiment, the work of Svensmark, that these cosmic rays tend to nucleate clouds. Well, you can't have a hurricane unless you have clouds moving across the Atlantic Ocean, let's say from Africa. So you need these tropical depressions to form where there are clouds, and then they can grow into hurricanes. So without clouds, no hurricanes.
Yeah.
So the supposition would be simple that increased cosmic rays cause more weather in certain bands, resulting in more hurricanes.
Sure. And granted, always correlation does not equal causation, but when you see a correlation like this,
you got to look into it.
Yeah, you have to investigate because it's so obviously coordinated here.
And so Tony Heller peer reviewed it real quick. He just, because he has all the data sets, and he said, yeah, he didn't fudge this.
Yeah.
This is laid out correctly, he didn't like align it. And so it's pretty astounding what's going on here. This clearly shows that the sun has direct effect on the weather at the surface. And because it's a stretch of 50 years here, it means that the sun controls the climate because the climate is 15 years or longer. So that's pretty interesting breakthrough there.
And yet you're a bad person if you say that the sun controls the climate.
Right. And so if we were to overlay CO2 on that, there would be no correlation.
Yeah.
Because it's a linear line straight up.
Yep.
Increasing regularly year after year. And that's because CO2 follows temperature. So this is pretty interesting science coming out. Any other thoughts on it?
No, I think that I think that the fact that there is such good science coming out and people like Willie Soon, becoming more and more vocal about stuff like this, it's part of the reason for the increased push to cancel people like Willie Soon.
Now, since the document came out from the Center for Countering Digital Hate, our subscribers haven't fallen off. We haven't been demonetized, which is what they're asking social media to do here. The document that they published is called The New Climate Denial: How Social Media Platforms and Content Producers Profit by Spreading New Forms of Climate Denial.
Yeah, first problem with this is the assumption that anybody that speaks against global warming has malicious intent, right? That they're just in it for the profit. Because this channel just makes so much money, we're just swimming in it, right? Like, so stupid. But that's assumption number one that is ridiculous.
I make the equivalent of working at McDonald's.
Yeah.
So the Center for Countering Digital Hate, it's an NGO that's funded probably by big climate.
It's dark money. It's not even really clear entirely who's funding them. I was reading some stuff yesterday that there may be a China connection in terms of how they're funded. But this group, Centered for, what is it? I always forget what it's called.
Center for
Countering Digital Hate, CCDH. There's a British arm and there's a US arm, and they are essentially producing reports like this in order to advise our federal government, to advise Google, to put pressure on companies like Google and Facebook. And I suspect as well, probably to advise like the World Economic Forum and the UN and the WHO and all of that. But it's like a big circle jerk, It's like the revolving door between the FDA and big pharma,
So their purpose is to protect human rights and civil liberties online. And I thought
while they recommend canceling people.
Right. They recommend destroying people and destroying their speech. A lot has happened. Like, I used to work for the ACLU, but they have shifted.
Yeah.
They have been shifted by the woke virus.
Yeah.
In the last 20 years, they've gone from a constitutionalist group to a completely left-leaning psychopathic conglomeration of nonsensical things.
Yeah, it's very bizarre how they've somehow managed to completely turn inside out any interest in actual free speech. It's so strange. By the way, I just want to point out too that CCDH, this group was also responsible for a report that came out a couple years ago, I think. I'm not sure exactly when it was, that identified the disinformation dozen, right? So this was a dozen people that they identified as spreading misinformation about the COVID vaccine. It didn't matter how well researched or how much evidence there was for their claims or how legitimate their concerns were. They were just the dirty disinformation dozen.
Well, this is actually in their mission statement here. It's complete insanity. At CCDH, we have developed a deep understanding of the online harm landscape. The online harm landscape.
Right. There's a world out there that is just meant for harm and malevolence. That's right.
So actual people that are actually doing science using the scientific method are actually hateful people.
Yeah. Yep.
How does that
and
connect?
It's also like it reminisces a little bit too of, you've got the what's called misinformation and disinformation and then malinformation, which is my favorite, right? Because malinformation is information that's true but harmful. So therefore it should be censored. Which is like, how Orwellian does it get? It's so crazy.
There he is. There's the guy.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so that's another thing that's interesting about this group is you've got Imran Ahmed, who's the CEO of this group. But this report and their other reports, they reference all their researchers, but they never name them.
They've never researched anything. These are talking points. Unprecedented wildfires. There is no evidence of that whatsoever if you look at the data. There were unprecedented wildfires 70 and 100 years ago. Yeah, not today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then the whole idea that floods are increasing is a lie.
Right.
They just used propaganda talking points inside this whole article.
Yeah. Well, and then it's heavily footnoted, right? But all of the footnotes, aside from all of the footnotes that are just sort of referencing where they got information from, they'll say something about us or other claims, and then they'll reference like a quote from one of our videos in the footnotes or whatever. So aside from all of that, the only other things that are cited are media articles and there's like a report from the UN or the IPCC or something like that. There are no academic citations whatsoever.
So here they go on to their list here, the new denial. The impacts of global warming are beneficial or harmless. Yes, that has been proven even by NASA that showed that the warming on Earth has greened the Earth by 30%.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have a single person researching anything in here. Almost all of this document can be debunked in a few seconds.
Well, here's another thing that's funny about this.
Climate solutions won't work. We know that. We just showed you the CO2 graph. Nothing that we have done has changed the amount of CO2 that is emitted by Earth.
Yeah. Right. Well, and they don't really, they really don't care. I can go way further in this. It's hilarious, right? Like, okay, one of the other people who's used as an example in this study is Tony Heller. And so what they do typically is they show a picture of a video preview, and then they talk about a statement that was made by the producer. He's on page 26. Next one down. Anyway, he says...
No, that's us.
That's us. Two more pages past that. Yeah. Right there. Okay, so they're saying here that he's making a false statement, and he says Arctic sea ice extent is also the highest for the date in the past 6 years. This graph proves that statement. So this is how stupid they are when they put this together. Is they're implying that the statement that he's making is wrong, while at the same time using an image from his video that proves that his statement is correct.
It's just a gaslighting.
Totally gaslighting. Now, like, a large part of the point of this report is they divide anti-global warming changes into old denial and new denial. And they say that, so old denial statements are things like global warming is not happening, or human-generated greenhouse gases are not causing global warming. New denial statements are the impacts of global warming are beneficial or harmless. Climate solutions won't work, blah, blah, blah. And then they they do this supposedly fancy thing with their AI and their little calculations to show that old denial claims, the incidence of them has gone down dramatically on YouTube, and new denial claims have gone up dramatically. But this is how unscientific it is. And then they say, well, that's because, how do they put it? Experts suggest climate deniers have changed tactics because the results of global warming and climate change are evident to the public. So we're just being manipulative jerks, changing our tactics to try to like fool and manipulate people. But what's really funny is that even if that's true, like their little calculation of old claims versus new ones have changed, it's likely because of YouTube algorithms and how they censor and demonetize, right? So if Google tends to demonetize a video that says that global warming is not happening, well, most creators are smart enough to try to work around that and phrase their claims differently or focus on it in a different way.
Yeah,
it's a function. It is a function of the censorship itself. In all, this
document is so unscientific. We could keep picking it apart here. 3.2, plants, animals, or reefs are benefiting. Yeah, their fear-mongering for 2 decades about the Great Barrier Reef dying is incorrect because in 2023, the Great Barrier Reef had the most coral ever recorded.
Right.
And scientists that are well-respected, like Jennifer Murahasi, have been trying to expose this for a decade. Yet that does not prevent the mainstream media from reporting the opposite, which is why the majority of the population is misinformed.
Right. Well, also, I mean, the way that this is framed is completely incorrect, right? Because when we talk about stuff like this, let's say when we talk about the greening of the earth as a result of increased carbon dioxide, right? This is something that we know is true because it's right in front of our faces and it's actually happening. Also, it's the same reason why you pump CO2 into greenhouses, because it boosts plant growth. But we're not saying that global warming per se is beneficial. We're saying that the CO2 rise is beneficial. And there is a benefit to warming as well, because when we look back in history, all civilizations have exploded during the warm periods, like the Roman warm, like the Minoan warm. That's when we've had high civilization. I mean,
and they all crumble when it gets cold.
Right.
Kind of interesting. But they never bring up actual pollutants in here. They're just talking about climate and plant food, which is funny. These green groups do nothing green.
No. And that's the saddest thing about all of this. Like, okay, I know that like when I was a kid in the 80s, I was really interested in environmentalist stuff. I had the giant long list from the World Wildlife Fund of all of the animals that were in danger of going extinct, but I also really cared about, pollutants in the world. It turns out some
polar bears were way up on there.
They were, and that turns out that wasn't even true. So that's funny. But, I mean, like things like PCBs in the environment and stuff like that. And then, I'm always frustrated by, I used to recycle like crazy, right? But then it became clear to me that all of the plastic that I'm putting in recycling, most of it ends up in a giant pile in a third world country, and then it just sits there. And it's like, that's not beneficial to anybody.
The ocean.
Well, that too. It's not beneficial to anybody, but nobody gives a crap about any of that. It's all about this stupid narrative.
Yeah, I think less than 5% of plastics are actually recycled.
Right. Because, again, a lot of it just sits there, it's limited by how many people actually do it, but then I'm glad that people don't do more of it because it would be worse in terms of what's ending up in our oceans.
Now, here's what the good news is, and I wish I pulled up some stats. In the last week, all of the mainstream media outlets across the board are firing everyone. They are going away. There's a shift in consumers across the world, in the first world.
Mm-hmm.
in the United States alone, all of the top news outlets have fired the majority of their staff. And this is going into an election cycle.
Yeah.
Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, all the big names, everyone is getting laid off. And that's it. There's not even a question why that's happening. Their viewership has tanked in the last 2 years.
Yeah.
They've been fed nothing but lies. They gobbled them up. They were forced to take experimental things. And now I think that a lot of them are opening their eyes. What do you think the percentage of the population is that is being red-pilled right now?
Oh God, I don't know.
Because all we need is a tipping point, 3 to 5%, and we win. That's how it worked with March Against Monsanto.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that would really help would be, obviously, if these mainstream media outlets are firing a lot of their staff due to lack of viewership and consumption, then there's a hole that couldn't be filled, right? Like if we could get that gap filled with actual, journalism that has integrity, that would be amazing. Because you still have a significant percentage of the population whose only news is from the mainstream outlets. And the mainstream outlets are not reporting things accurately. They're leaving a lot of information out. And so then you have this segment of the population that's just completely not informed or misinformed, which is funny because that's what they say, right? They say, we're misinforming everybody.
Yeah, that's what they say. And so there's good reason for it. And Glenn Greenwald pointed this out yesterday in his show. He had on someone. Well, first he made fun of Taylor Lorenz, which I like, because she is one of the most inaccurate journalists ever in history. Like the majority of things she said in her career have been incorrect. And this is one of the reasons why the mainstream media is collapsing and they're firing people, because they are not doing journalism. There has been almost no journalism for 20 years coming out from these so-called mainstream media outlets. And since we know, as of 2012, the majority of what's coming out is propaganda that's fed down from the top. So everyone can just go from channel to channel and channel, and they're all saying the same exact thing.
Yeah.
And people are picking it up, especially what happened in the last few years, because they were put in harm's way and they may have been injured by listening to this propaganda.
Yeah. Well, and like it's organizations like this, the CCDH, with, when they produce reports like this. So I forgot to mention with the previous report that they did about the disinformation dozen, that apparently was used by the federal government to put pressure on social media companies to censor that disinformation dozen. So what's happening is you've got this top down, we're making these recommendations and we're creating this pressure to remove this information from the environment so that people don't have access to it, which creates a situation where people don't have the ability to listen to all sides and make up their own mind about what makes the most sense. I mean, they're purposely removing one side of the equation so that people don't have the opportunity to do that, which is why all of this misinformation, disinformation, malinformation is so insidious and so bad for society, and why our First Amendment is so extremely important,
Well, and this isn't new. This type of government control of science was warned about by FDR, I think. I mean, that's how far ago it goes.
Right.
Once, and then in the 90s, the full shift of the National Science Foundation to the U.S. government. And then it was over. It was over in 1990. And then in 2012, the Smith Modernization Act. And it's all orchestrated by this agenda of the globalists to take control of the entire planet. But it's failing. And that's the good news.
Yeah.
We see it on the border of Texas. It's failing.
Yeah.
That's the good news. We see it in the mainstream media. They're laying everyone off because it's failing. Their propaganda machine, people are catching on, and we only need 3 to 5%, because once those 3 to 5% know, they start telling their friends, whether they believe them or not, the information gets out there.
Well, and then the more that the information is out there, I think the bolder regular people are to actually state what they believe is true. because we're living in this climate where sometimes you find yourself in situations where you want to like correct someone or say, I think that this is actually what's happening and here's the evidence why. But because there's so much brainwashing, the pushback from that can be pretty severe and sometimes even ruins relationships and stuff. So I think that the more people talk about this, the more they're comfortable talking about it just because other people are doing it.
Yeah, but where is this all headed? Because it's not headed into a good place.
No. I mean, like you said before, this is not new. This sort of shaping and guiding of science and censoring the information that we don't want people to talk about. This isn't new, and that's the reason why books like 1984 were written, because the writing was on the wall about where this was going and that it would happen again, and lo and behold, it has. I remember so vividly reading those books, and I could see how we could end up there. I just never thought it would happen as quickly as it has.
Yeah, and it's complete clown world. We have people purchasing $75,000 cars that run on toy batteries that can't operate in the cold, that you have to throw out in 6 years. Who's buying a car for $12,000 a year that you throw out? It's the stupidest thing, but it's to save the planet, so that if 1 billion people buy this thing that we throw out, we'll have 1 billion giant batteries polluting the surface of the earth forever. And there is no sustainable answer to any of this. Yeah, we'll just keep putting toxic photovoltaic cells over the entire earth, shielding the surface from the sun. I mean, and everyone will eat bugs that are churned out of some factory in the center of a 15-minute city. Who wants that? Like in a room of 1,000 people, raise your hand if you want that. People are going to put their hand up.
Right. Well, and it's precisely because, I mean, it's funny, right? The one of the quote unquote new denial claims that the CCDH report talks about is that climate solutions won't work, which you brought up. We know we're showing that is the case, right? And people are experiencing that in their real lives. I mean, think about the cold wave that hit Texas. Was that last year or the year before? I don't remember. Which destroyed their windmills and stuff, and like it was a huge problem. It's like the same thing with the EVs. In real life, often these things don't actually work out, and so people are not prone to go along with that because it doesn't work and it affects them in a very real way in their day-to-day lives.
Well, they just had another cold outbreak that pushed all the way down to Texas, but Tennessee got the worst hit. Tennessee, West Tennessee recorded the lowest temperature ever, and they had pipes bursting everywhere and the infrastructure failed.
Right.
Because it's never been this cold.
Right.
But that same week, as predicted by Tony Heller, one of our fellow climate deniers, it's hilarious. Tony Heller pointed out that as soon as it gets cold, the headlines are going to be global warming causes cooling. And that's what happened. That's
what they did the week before the cold spell. I mean, that was like on purpose, planned. It was very obvious.
It also
like we have to dispel what people might think when they encounter cold weather. We better counter that ahead of time, as if that's going to work. I don't know. Maybe it does work on some people, right? Because I do see some people yammering on about how insanely hot it is, and I'm like, okay, maybe you live in a place where it's warmer or whatever, but like this alarmist, it's like so hot that I have to hang blankets in my windows and it's like, are you just dreaming this up? It's like a psychosomatic response almost.
Yeah, we've been here a decade, and it was 114 the second year we were here. It's never been even close to that hot.
Yeah.
So the temperature changes. There's cycles of hot and cold and heat waves. It's like people don't remember when we were kids. Remember there were such a thing as a heat wave and a cold wave, and it wasn't our fault because they happen all the time.
Right. Well, and this brings up, of course, again, another thing that the global warmists never talk about, right? The only thing they ever talk about is CO2 and now methane, is causing the earth to warm or whatever. But okay, what about the other like well-known patterns on earth, like things like El Nino and La Nina and the AMOC and like how the jet streams change and all of that? Like, how come they're not accounting for all of that stuff?
Because it's too obvious, just like hurricane frequency is controlled by the solar cycle.
Well, and again, because it's on a cycle, a regular cycle. Then when we look at the data, we can use that because it's very predictable.
Yeah, it's insane. The world we live in is crazy. It's been decades in the making. The brainwashing is pretty much complete. Like, there's a huge portion of the population that thinks that controlling CO2 and carbon credits is going to do something.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what it's going to do. It's going to make you a slave, more enslaved than you have ever been, where they're going to monitor everything you eat, every step you take, every gallon of gas you buy, every inch you move across the surface of the earth. It will all be cataloged, and it will all be your fault. And you'll have to pay taxes on it. And
Yeah.
you'll be denied certain services because you're a bad person, because you created too much CO2. It's nonsense.
That's the exact thing I was going to say next, right? Like, there's a psychological element to this, which is that you are supposed to feel guilty and bad just for existing. We talk now about humans exhaling CO2 and how horrible that is. I mean, I know somebody who is susceptible to this, who literally like walks around feeling guilty because of their carbon footprint. Also feels guilty for being a white person. All of that stuff, all of this stuff, all of these narratives are geared towards making you feel bad for existing, which tells me right there that at the end of the day, this is a depopulation agenda, plain and simple.
It's right in plain sight. The new headline this week, wait for it. Can you believe this? That growing an organic garden behind your house is a higher carbon footprint than buying the toxic food in the grocery store.
Yep, I saw that.
Absolutely disgusting.
Yeah.
They want you to be guilty because you're eating food that doesn't have pesticides on it that's making you healthy.
Well, also they want you
why?
to be...
Because you're taking money away from the pharmaceutical industry, you're taking away money from the doctors, and their whole cabal of liars that are in place to keep you stuck in the machine on 47 pharmaceuticals and on insurance and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously geared towards you're a bad person if you're not dependent on the global system. If you're not dependent on big ag and, like you said, big pharma, right? Because when you start eating everything big ag, well, guess what? You get sick, and then you're dependent on big pharma, and then you're dependent on big med, right? It just goes on and on and on. So you're a bad person for taking care of yourself. This is interesting. I mentioned this to you last night. I was watching a photo reel of photos from the Great Depression. And there's a lot of photos in there, of the Dust Bowl era, like the Oklahoma area and like what people were going through there. And, but generally the Great Depression. And the narrator was explaining that a lot of these photos were taken by the government, and the photos that they did not want to be shown to the public, they would put a punch through the photo. So you can see which photos have the punch because it's visible in the image. And what was so interesting to me is that all of the images where people look really like sad and down on their luck were not punched, but all of the images where people are making the best of their situation, being self-reliant and like doing the best they can with what they have and looking reasonably healthy and happy even, those were the ones that were hole punched. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, they're trying to erase the good memories, maybe.
Well, but I think maybe there's an element of like discouraging self-reliance, right? Because we're seeing that again today. Like, don't you dare be self-reliant, because it doesn't feed the globalists to do that. So I suspect that the agenda may not have been that different.
I think the line has been drawn in the sand, especially over in Texas, and things are going to escalate towards the election in November.
Yeah.
Now, it's anyone's guess what that means, but if you haven't started preparing for some eventuality, no power, no internet, you need to have food on hand, and you need to start learning how to grow your own food and stop listening to the propagandists. And really, if this is you're just dabbling into this, you just took the red pill, time hasn't run out. People think, oh, I haven't been doing all this, I'm not ready. You need to start now.
Yeah. Yeah. And my advice to people especially people who are just getting started, but really anybody, is if you're you can't gather all of the supplies that you'll ever need. It's just not possible. So the trick is to gather enough of that thing that you're going to need, just enough to buy you enough time to figure out how you're going to deal with it later. That's it. And that way you can cover a lot of ground in terms of what you're prepping.
Yeah, you'll be a lot more relaxed and have a peace of mind if you have a week or a month's worth of food.
Yeah.
And you'll be like, oh, we've got that up in the attic or in the closet. But what's more important is a long-term plan to learn how to grow food, have community. It's spring, it's early. The San Luis Valley Seed Exchange is at the end of March. Seed exchanges are happening around the world. In Zone 8 and 9 in the South, they've already begun. There's already plant swaps. There are areas in the US you can start growing today. It's not hard, but you need to learn how to fail in order to be successful. These are preparedness tips that could save your life.
You've got a whole growing season ahead of you between now and the election. Get to it.
Love you.
Find us tonight on Magnetic Reversal News at 8 p.m. Mountain.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.